All right, I think our participant numbers are leveling off here. So welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm Kirsten Loita of Osage University Partners. I'll be moderating our discussion today on the recommendations for life science term sheets, which was released a few months back and worked on by a set of universities and venture capital groups. Next slide. The people who worked on this project are noted on this slide, and we'd like to acknowledge really all the hard work that they put into this effort. We know it's not easy, but thank you for taking all the time to do this. We're really fortunate to have a few of these people here with us today to talk about the recommendations, and I'd like for them to introduce ourselves. So let's go ahead to slides to our people, and we'll start off with Bill. Can you go to the next slide, Natasha?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Bill Harrington. I'm one of the managing partners here at OUP. I'm a physician originally, been in venture for about 25 years, 11 of which have been here at OUP from the early days. And I manage our life science and biotech investing activities and have been busy building our life science team over these last 10 years. And we're continuing to grow going forward. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Bill. Sarah.
Hey everyone, Sarah Reed. I work at RA Capital, and yes, I am walking the walk and talking the talk of healthcare investing. I am on a treadmill desk, which is why I'm rocking back and forth. I know vastly less about licensing deals than probably anybody on this call. I think that's an advantage. I come with a fresh perspective. I've done, of course, licensing deals, but not as many as you all have. The reason I'm really involved in this initiative is I'm the founding person behind the NVCA model venture financing documents initiative. I brought that group together and I'm still heavily involved. So we can talk about that later. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, Sarah, and look forward to talking more about that. Terrific. Oren.
Hi, everyone. Oren Herskowitz from Columbia University. I run the tech transfer office at Columbia. I've been there about 15 years, was at the Boston Consulting Group before that. I wear a lot of other hats, mostly having to do with innovation, entrepreneurship, tech-based economic development, federal or state funding policies around science policy as it relates to translational science, things like that. And we run a bunch of virtual accelerators here at Columbia to help these ideas get through the valley of death. And looking forward to today's talk.
Great. Thanks, Oren. Karen.
Thanks. I'm Karen Nimmergluck, the Executive Director of Stanford's Office of Technology Licensing. I've been at Stanford for 3 years now. Came from many years within the University of California system, most of those at UCSF. Our office manages all of Stanford's intellectual property, licensing and commercialization, and we also have the industrial contracts office within the OTL, so we manage all of the industry research agreements as well. Thanks.
Great. Karen, so glad you could make it today. And Karen subbed in last moment, so thank you so much. She's been heavily involved in these. So glad you could be here. And I know this is going to be a really educational session today. I'm sure people have lots of questions about the documents that you came up with. For the next slide, we do encourage our audience to submit relevant questions throughout this webinar. If you'd like to submit a question at any point, please use the Q&A feature on your toolbar, which someone already did. They asked about the recording. There will be a recording of this webinar that we will put up in our portal, which we note here, which is available to the tech transfer offices that work with us. But there will also be a version available of this on our YouTube channel as well. And we'll also send a copy of the recording, a couple of the relevant slides to all the people who registered for this afterwards. So we're going to go ahead and dive into our subject on the next slide. In the spring of 2020, a group of 7 universities and 6 VCs got together to discuss challenges both parties routinely face when working on life science deals together. Over the following months, they developed a set of best practices for both the negotiation process of these deals for the term sheet themselves. Here are the overall topics that we're planning on talking about today, but I know how much our audiences love to ask questions, so I'm sure we're going to veer into other areas as well. Hopefully you all have those documents in front of you. If not, I'm going to put them in the chat in just a bit in case you want to reference those throughout our discussion today. So we're going to take down the slides for just a few minutes. We're going to put them back up in a couple of minutes when we talk about some specific things. But Oren, I'd love for you to start off by telling us about the process and goals that you had in mind when this group was convened.
Sure, happy to do so. And I'll sort of give the short version, but happy to go into as long as people want. So this started with an observation, I think, at Columbia, which, Afra and I and Afra's team had been having a lot of conversations around that, even in a place like Columbia, where we do 100+ commercial transactions a year, 20 to 30 startups a year, every year, where we know a lot of the VC community, consider many of the VCs to be both personal and professional friends and colleagues. Even with those advantages of scale and depth of relationships, we still found that, we would end up starting many of these discussions and they would kind of go off the rails in weird ways. You'd think we were aligned in terms of what we were trying to accomplish, and we'd even sometimes done deals together before. And yet every time we sat down to negotiate something, it was like starting over from scratch. And we, the VC would kind of like armor up, and we would armor up, and we'd go in and we'd play the same games over and over again about like, anti-dilution's ridiculous, or royalties, what's a royalty? And we, the universities would say, 50% non-royalty sublicensing income, and we get other product royalties forever, and we want a voting board seat. And we kind of beat each other around the ears. And then after 6 months went by, we would finally come to the same agreement we came to last time, basically. And so we figured there had to be a better way of working on this. But after talking to some of our peers at Yale and MIT and Stanford and Penn and Duke and Johns Hopkins and others, we heard the same thing from everyone else, that like everyone had the same frustrations. And when we talked to some of the VCs that we work with fairly frequently, like Polaris and Venrock and RA and 5AM and others, Atlas, they said it was the same thing for them when they were working with the university. So we were all like, it was just a lose-lose. Like everybody's frustrated, everyone's spending more money than necessary, everyone's doing relationship damage, these deals are not happening. And in our field, in life sciences in particular, every month of delay translates pretty directly to patient lives lost. So like, it's not only an economic loss, it's an actual societal loss. And so in talking to the group, the VCs and the universities, we realized that if this was hard for those of the VCs with experience and scale and tech transfer offices with experience and scale, where at least we knew the game we were stupidly playing. But if you were a smaller university or a first-time VC or a VC that has never worked with a university before, you don't even know what's right or wrong necessarily. And so these debates can get very personal and can damage reputations really quickly, and in addition to leading to Scotch deals. So the thought was, gee, let's get everyone together at autumn. This was going to be, March 12th in San Diego last year. Everybody had tickets bought to fly out. We're going to spend the whole day locked in a room, in a very small room, in very close quarters, as crazy as that sounds now, and try and hammer out some concepts, some like almost akin to, Kirsten and Karen, what Stanford led back at the 9 points for central licensing back in the day, and try and come up with some guidelines that could be helpful. Of course, 4 days before autumn, we had to cancel for obvious reasons. In retrospect, turned out to be a really good decision. At the time, was not an easy decision. We'd spent a year booking the meetings. And instead, we decided to do this over Zoom. And shockingly, I actually think that worked way better than it would have worked if we were in person. Because I think if we were in person, it would have been one meeting, and then we would have said, awesome, let's reconvene next year. And nothing would have happened in the meantime. In this way, it ended up being 3 different Zoom meetings, like 2 or 3 hours apiece over the next 3 months. And we hammered out these documents. And I think everybody was quite happy with the way they turned out. So that's kind of the backstory. Yeah.
That's a great backstory. A lot of fun. Sarah, as a GC at a venture capital firm, what interested you in working on this?
Yeah, thanks. Well, everything that Oren said just so resonates with me, because it totally replicates the experience I had coming up with model financing documents for the venture capital industry. I joined a venture capital firm during the internet bubble. There weren't many in-house counsel at venture capital firms at that time, and I hadn't done many financing transactions. I was hired really to provide legal services to the portfolio companies. And I did maybe a dozen transactions, and at that point stepped back and said, wow, this seems so broken for really all the reasons that Oren said. You know, I'm doing these 12 deals, I'm spending all this time and money, and at the end of the day, there's really not that much swing in these deals in the terms where, you know, we spend endless cycles, and I work with 12 different law firms, and I end up with 12 different sets of documents that I have to, you know, sweat every detail, read every sentence. But they're really not that different. About 80% of the contents is the same. 20% is different. And so I'm not quite experienced enough yet to know in that 20%, just as a matter of common sense, some of it is better, some of it are improvements, and everyone should have that in their documents. And some of the 20% is broken or not as good and should be removed. So why don't we all, you know, these 12 leading firms that do these deals, why don't we all just get together and say, give me your best stuff. You know, what have you noticed in documents that are bugs that you fixed? What are features that you've added? And we'll come up with a consensus set of best practices documents. I feel very convinced this project is going to work, given all the frustrations that Oren expressed. I think there's a kind of, first of all, you need to have a sufficiently engaged group of customers for this kind of project, which you clearly do with the universities, and that sense of frustration and realization that, like, this, forget it, this has gone on for too long. And also the very important impetus, you know, even more so in your case, of if we can come up with a better process and kind of agree in advance, at least on some terms, so we don't have to spend as long negotiating them, there's really a tremendous societal benefit. As Oren said, you will be able to do more deals. I look now at my own firm, and we've done well over 100 private placements in biotech startups in the past year. We couldn't do that number of deals without the model documents. It makes them like a factory, right? We now just say, hey, red line against the model documents. You know, you can quickly look at them. I don't have to read every sentence and go, God, where's the mistake in here? You know, like, where's Waldo in these documents? So I think it really will not only reduce friction, but I would hope to see that in a few years that everybody's just doing more of these transactions because they're just so much more efficient and less costly. Also, to pick up on Oren's point about another, you know, really laudable goal of doing this, and it was one of our goals with the model documents, is so that, you know, somebody in Kansas can do a venture financing who's never done one before, or the smaller institutions, to take out that fear factor. Like, here are the documents, they're open sourced, we explain everything, we say kind of like, here are the 3 flavors, here's the flavor you're going to get if you're the one who has the negotiating power, everything's annotated and explained. Our documents have now been translated to Chinese, the British Venture Capital Association adopted them, so I think all that will be tremendous too for universities who feel like, oh, are we being cheated? We don't really know what's going on, to kind of open source what terms are acceptable. So yes, I'm thrilled to be involved in this project and think it will have great success.
Kristen, I did want to mention something I was remiss in saying. Like, one of the, actually, before I think we went to any of the other VCs, we went to our normal first stop for essentially any brain teaser type question, which was calling Bill and Mark at OUP, because one of the great things about working with OUP is that I think, you know, as not only as venture capitalists, but probably as the venture capitalists who most deeply understand the challenges that universities are working under, And, and Kirsten, you being involved there too with your experience from Stanford. Just wanted to, when we want to gut check something and sort of get both sides of the coin, like what's actually going on here? None of the issues that we talked about were easy. There was different points of view. And just getting through that morass of like, when is something you're getting cheated and when is there's just different ways of looking at it is a huge benefit, even if you don't resolve the answer. And so Bill, as usual, was incredibly helpful in just saying like, yeah, this is something worth doing.
That's good to hear. We actually already have a question in, and because it's pre the actual nitty gritty of the documents, I do want to address this one now, which is, were outside law firms involved, and because don't they have an incentive to redline as much as possible? And how can we get those folks on board then with this too? So who would like to address that one? Sarah?
I'd love to address that one because
Okay.
when I first started organizing my group, and what I actually did was I knew there were two huge law firms that had the biggest market share. And I called the first one and said, would you like to be involved? And they said, are you kidding me? This is like a huge revenue generator for us. And I said, well, that's too bad because your main competitor is really supportive and is going to help out on this project. And they said, oh, wow, if that's true, okay, never mind, I'm helping out. I hung up, I immediately called the main competitor and said, hey, this other firm's working on it. Do you guys want to get involved? And so that worked out that way. But I think that when you have the demand from the customers, the law firms have to bend, right? And here, and also the law firms will eventually come to realize, as law firms have with the model documents, like I said, we did 100 transactions. Now, law firms, if absent the model documents, which a bright first-year associate can pick up and figure out what to do and fill in the blanks and get it most of the way there with some then senior help, it enables them to have a lot higher volume. So I think overall, I don't think they've lost out. I mean, law firms always figure out a way. They've not lost out on any revenue. I think they've made up with volume because they can now, instead of doing each deal as an artisanal deal, which it shouldn't be. So I think both, they eventually come to realize it, but in the short term, it's because the customers, the VCs and the universities just say, hey, I mean, this is what I'm using.
I was going to say from the tech transfer perspective, I have a story that I think really gives a good picture of where the licensing staff can help on this front, by communicating to the entrepreneurs. So I had a situation that many years ago around a startup. It was actually a spin-off out of a pharma company. They were spinning out a certain division of their pipeline, and I got a call. So we'd been negotiating, it's essentially like a startup negotiation. And I got a call from the CEO complaining, I have spent more on paying the law firm who's negotiating with you than you expect to get in upfront fees and what the equity is likely to be worth. And I said, yeah, let's just take a moment and talk that through and think about this. And as I started to explain, the lawyer is someone who knew the university's boundaries. They had negotiated with the university over and over and over again. And they nonetheless continued to redline the indemnification section, the limited liability section, the reservation of rights section. So standard clauses that this lawyer knew would not be acceptable to the university in the form that he was putting them. And I said, so, really, I think the choice is yours. Do you want to continue using this attorney or not? Because this, I can keep negotiating with this guy, until doomsday. And I'm telling you, like the next week, I got a call we're working with a different law firm. We went down, the law firm was in Palo Alto. We drove down, we sat in a room, and the whole thing was hammered out in 2 hours.
Yeah.
So, again, I think it helps to be upfront with the entrepreneur if you feel like the law firm is taking them for a ride.
Yeah, I also want to make it clear, like this, there are plenty of awesome outside counsel out there. And we, in order to help guide our entrepreneurs and startups at Columbia, we've created something on our website where there's 5 law firms, 5, I'm looking at, there's 5 law firms on there now that are not conflicted with Columbia. So they're not paid by us in any way, that have received really high recommendations from our startups in the past, and that also have reviewed our model agreement and essentially have sort of pre-argued with us on, to Karen's point about, like, look, let's just agree that, like, our reservation of rights clause, like, we're not going to violate BIDL with this license agreement. We're not. So don't redline that section. Let's focus on the parts that are going to be really meaningful to your startup. And so things get done much faster, and they've been phenomenal. But yeah, we worry in particular, like our nightmare scenario is when the startup shows up and is like, well, yeah, I hired an attorney. My cousin is a tax attorney. So how hard could this be? And then we're like, oh, we're never going to get out of this negotiation. So anyway.
Go ahead.
It's worth noting that we do have law firms who are going to be participating with us as we try to craft a model term sheet. Repeat players. So we realize, yes, of course, we need their buy-in up front. And, amen to what Karen said. And even if we can get the boilerplate, honestly, it's boilerplate part of the documents, that 50%, just like this works, it's fine, it's acceptable to all the universities, and just eliminate the negotiation and save the negotiation for the harder stuff, that alone will be a leap forward.
For investors, for venture investors today, when we're looking at a company that's either already raised venture money, or we're looking at participating in a financing that's already has a term sheet in play, if the prevailing documents aren't the NVCA model docs, or the term sheet's not the model term sheet, it raises an orange, if not a red flag, that, like, why not? What's going on here? And oftentimes when you dig in, you find out it's either, a brother who's a tax attorney, or an inexperienced entrepreneur, or, an adversarial law firm and management team that you really don't want to get in bed with. So, it has really evolved from a nice to have to now, a box you need to check. And if you can't check it, why not? Occasionally there are, circumstances that would drive you in a different direction, but it's really very much the exception these days.
So there's one other group that people are asking about perspectives on these recommendations and for the terms. And that is actually about the eventual customers of the startup, right? The potential acquirers of these startups and getting in perhaps, pharma or large biotech involved in the discussions as well, and whether those were considered too. Oren, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, but that's a really interesting idea. I think most people probably appreciate that it was almost an unbelievable task to get this many people involved. and I've fielded calls from other universities who are outstanding universities with whom we partner all the time, saying, or VCs saying, like, why was I left off? And the short answer is, like, can you imagine trying to have a 13-person conversation that actually is functional? Then make that 20 or 30. So no, a little bit out of laziness. I also, maybe it's naive on our part to be interested in Bill and Sarah's perspective, but as universities, I think we tend to really defer to the VCs on what's going to be acceptable for an acquisition from pharma. That's so far away from where we live that we've kind of assumed that you guys are speaking for big pharma, and therefore that if you've approved something in these documents that they're going to functionally work. Because if they don't work for big pharma, then there goes your acquisition. But I don't know if that's, Bill or Sarah, I don't know if that's fair.
I think that's an excellent point. And in a sense, it's an opportunity to call BS on the VCs, right? Because we do have a lot of assumptions. That's often our pushback. And, I know I'm sincere when I say it, like, my God, if we put that in there, it's just, we're going to have to amend it when the company gets acquired. That's never going to fly with big pharma. You have to have the right to sublicense through tiers or whatever. So I don't know, it might be an interesting idea to have a really seasoned person from one or two big pharmas who do a lot of acquisitions and deal with these kinds of issues. Because I'm willing to have somebody say, actually, I think we know from our own experience what's important, but they may be a value add.
I mean, Amy Schulman from Polaris, luckily, was the general counsel at Pfizer for many years. So she was involved but I think she was wearing her VC hat pretty squarely.
All right. Well, we do have a few more questions, but I'm going to put those in as we talk about some other things. So I do want us to start delving into the nitty gritty of what you guys actually came up with. So we're going to pull back up the slides really quickly, because we're just going to show a little bit about the process document. So as I mentioned, there are two different documents that you guys created. So the next slide shows the process improvements. And Karen and Bill, could you talk about, so we have this process improvement document as well as the term sheet recommendation. So let's just talk for 5 minutes about the process improvements part of this. Can you outline, Karen and Bill, the 4 main areas covered in the process document, and then make some certain highlights for each of those areas? So let's start with starting the conversation, the initial part of this.
Well, I think what really motivated this, and maybe motivated this whole effort, as Oren referenced, is, from the perspective of the VCs, there's this feeling that, it took me a few weeks to negotiate a deal with a company, and it's taken me 6 months to get the license negotiated with the university. Why does it take so long? So we kind of came at this from why is the process so long? One of the big issues is it tends to be very sequential and compartmented. We do it, send it over to a lawyer looks at it, sends it to the university, it works its way through the university. A month later, a red line comes back or nothing comes back, and you call, and you go through that cycle over and over again. So what was clear, I think, to everyone who's been involved in these is you want to really cut to the business decision and decision makers early. So, have more senior folks from the venture fund and from the university discuss what you're really trying to achieve. Some of that is outlining what you really want to do with the technology, what the company is going to do, what the founder's role is or is not going to be going forward, and just kind of get some agreement philosophically around what you want to do. And then, in that initial meeting, really lay out what you need to do to get there. And, having attorneys present early avoids the issue of attorneys adding to the document and adding value to their client later in the process, which I think is a source of a lot of friction, even outside of university negotiations, but any venture negotiation when attorneys are trying to add value and prove that they're worth the money we're paying them. But I think having them in early and aligning the legal and business objectives early really does streamline that process, and then setting up a timeline for exchange of information and discuss, like, how are we going to process red lines and responses, and who's going to look at them? Does it need to kind of go to a junior person, then a medium level person, then to the director, or can we short circuit that? And at what point can you delegate the back and forth to more junior people who have more time and bandwidth and can do it in a more expedited fashion? So really getting the conversation going, the key is to get everyone aligned and on the same page in both sides, including the business representatives. I'll call them business representatives and legal representatives.
And I would add, at the university, there are often several stakeholders that need to weigh in on a startup deal. And it's really important, first of all, to aim for parallel processing to the extent that you can. Don't send things to different people sequentially. Just get the draft out to whoever needs to see it, and get everyone's comments back in, and then maybe set up a meeting to build consensus. it's really, really important to make sure all of those stakeholders are on the same page. And I imagine to some extent it's the same for, you know, some venture firms in you know, with their counsel. I have found it really important to get, particularly, so if you're a university that has to work with counsel on your license agreements, have that discussion up front with your in-house attorney about where you see possible risks and how you believe they can be mitigated and what the overall business goal is, so that that attorney is now primed for, you know, understanding what the business goal is, but also they're comfortable that you now understand the risks, and you can work with them, you know, on those mitigation strategies, so that they don't just come into a negotiation saying, no, we can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. So they're already primed to think about workarounds if that's, you know, what's needed. It's also really helpful if it's going to be a complicated negotiation, you know, because of the nature of maybe, you know, maybe you've got many different technologies going into a license and different inventors. Set up, if you can, standing meetings, so regular meetings, you know, hopefully every week, if that's possible, with the key decision makers, so that, you know, if there are areas of trouble, that you can get those dealt with really quickly, and that you've got the decision makers on board. And if you don't need the meeting, that's fine. Then you just cancel it and everyone gets a free hour.
And I also really appreciated, I think one of the things that you also mentioned for the initial meeting is actually setting a timeline, kind of like, okay, here's our goal. Yeah. Like, we're going to have this timeline and here's how we're going to potentially get there too. But I think the standing meetings are a really important point. Oren, you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I was just going to say there was also a little bit of outside counsel bashing that went on during this part of the discussion. If you read the document, I mean, again, it's a small minority of firms, but at least one or two of them have a disproportionate market share in the field. I'm not going to say any names, but I'm guessing many people know at least some of the people I'm talking about. But there's like a history of these certain kind of like almost dirty tricks. Like, and frankly, there's games on both sides. So it's counsel for both parties. It's also the business people for both parties. But there were some sort of common types of like bad behavior that seemed to come up over and over again. And so even just, we hoped as a group by calling those out in the document, which is, it's section 3A. We're hoping that by calling them out, we will stop some of these behaviors that we just unfortunately see over and over again. And it's a little silly because at least in the university world, and Sarah and Bill, I'm curious if it's true on the venture world too, but we all know each other. Like, I mean, Karen, how many emails a week do you think you and I exchange in a given week?
Many.
So like
emails and texts, we're in, yes, constant conversations.
Right. So when someone says like, well, you know, this is the way Stanford does it, like we're 30 seconds away from finding out the way Stanford does it. But it's amazing to me how many times that gets thrown around. So like, these are just, we're hoping that by calling out some of these, let's call them misunderstandings, that we can kind of tamp them down.
Great. And is there anything that you guys wanted to mention about the fourth point on here, which is the ways universities can be helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, for those universities that allow their faculty founders, startups to sponsor research back in their labs, I think, you know, thinking ahead to how that could be structured, what that's going to look like, you know, thinking about any conflict of interest considerations and management plans that need to be addressed early on is really helpful. You know, even if you're at one of the few universities that does not allow that, you know, you might consider introducing the startup to labs that are working in similar areas that, you know, might be of interest to the startup to, you know, collaborate with. Certainly, if whether or not certain improvements are included in the license, we do have a section that goes into that in the guidelines. It's if there's an improvement, even if you didn't include it in the license, the most likely best home for it is going to be the startup, because they've got likely the background in dominating IP. And even if they don't, you want to help the startup succeed. I mean, I think you're both aligned on that. And you don't want to start splitting technologies, like splitting hairs and not having the technology fully developed. Of course, yeah, I mean, introductions to your core facilities, I think is really helpful. As we point out, many universities can give startups a discounted rate. I think in some cases it might be helpful to make introductions to potential other funders, although I know the major venture firms have their own ideas about who they want to co-invest with. As I think as one venture capitalist mentioned on the committee, shame on me if I don't already know that, but I think there are probably other investors that aren't as experienced working with universities that might be able to benefit from that. And then of course, promoting your startups through your social media accounts or through your marketing efforts. I think that's always helpful.
Definitely. Great. Well, thanks for all the comments on the process. Oh, Bill, you wanted to make
one other comment that, we're tend to throw the attorneys under the bus a little bit here, but, one thing that the venture investors all represented to varying extents is the feedback from the university at times that, well, this is policy, like we can't move on this. I'd love to, but my hands are tied. And, while there are some legitimate, hard stops in terms of what universities can and can't do, most of it is, policy that they've defined. It's not, something that they're forced to do or not do. So, that drives the venture guys crazy. And, I've seen it myself. And it turns out when you dig in a little bit, well, it's just the way it's always been done, not that it's immutable. And I just think coming back with this is how it's always done at our university, or it's policy, or, we can't do anything about it, is just met with a lot of suspicion.
Yeah,
and
thanks for
careful to reserve that for situations where in fact there are hard rules and regulations around what you can and can't do, and then address the rest of it as you would any other negotiating point.
Thanks for bringing that up, Bill. And I want to emphasize, I think it's that's kind of a shame on you situation for a tech transfer office if their negotiators are just saying, well, that's policy, we can't do it. I hate someone just calling out policy without being able to explain why that policy is in place and what the real issue is. So I think it's a matter of getting to, maybe it's the academic freedom issue or something, or publication, that we have to publish. Well, is there some way that you can delay a little longer in, with respect to identifying the clinical lead, or, the structure of the clinical lead? I mean, they're just ways to slice and dice things to maybe work around some policies. And I really appreciate what Bill said. And I think it's something that the tech transfer offices need to work on.
Yeah, and it was definitely, I also had one of those like shame on us moments when that was a really interesting part of the discussion. And I think on both sides, because we learned a lot about the way our behaviors are seen, even when they're well-intentioned. And so there's a difference between things that are the law. We are bound by Dole, and we have to follow there's certain things in the agreement that are just the law. And then there's some things that truly are policy at the university, like we are unable to offer them. And then there's a lot of things that are kind of just market. And that doesn't actually mean that they're any less important. But if we like if you say it's our policy to get royalties, like I guarantee you there is no university in the country that actually has something in their policy handbook about getting royalties. Why? On the other hand, it's not really helpful for the other side to come in and say, well, tell me why you deserve any royalties. Well, I mean, we deserve royalties because that's market. That's how deals get done. Like you wouldn't walk into a car lot and be like, I think I'd like to pay $5 for that car. You know, there's a blue book and there's market, and you know where you're sort of to Sarah's point earlier, these deals all end up in the same place, basically. So certain things they're there because they're there, but there's other things that are there because we've not been creative enough to figure out a way around them. And I think knowing the difference and calling them what they are is really important.
And Oren, I'm going to have you just stay on that a little bit because I know, and because next we're getting into the actual recommendations themselves. But one important person brought up, you know, maybe it'd be good to just really quickly talk about the fact that the difference between state and private universities. And that also plays some roles in this here that is sometimes, I think, sometimes confusing for those who are outside that system to understand that state universities may have obligations that other universities don't, and you just don't see those normally if you're not working with a state institution otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think Karen, having worked for UCSF
Oh, yeah.
and now Stanford, is really the right person.
Okay, Karen.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, it depends on how the the charter for the university, but there are definitely state universities that are governed by the state laws, and so they do have to abide by those. And I know within the University of California system, you know, we were always trained that the Regent's standing order, you know, was really like those were they had the effect of California state law essentially. So they were incorporated into policy. But again, you know, I think it's helpful to explain to the other side why you know, that standing order or that law is in place. You know, what is it protecting? What is the actual issue? And how can you maybe work around or find an alternative solution?
Great. All right. Well, so next we're going to get into the term sheet structure itself. And the first area that you actually tackle on the term sheet is equity. And the group charted out 3 common approaches on equity. Oren, we have a slide here that just shows these briefly. Could you briefly talk about one of these? And Sarah, I'm going to have you provide the VC perspective on these after Oren goes through it.
So this was actually surprisingly, like, I think many of us came into this thinking that if we just got agreement on equity, we would have done a huge service. And it turns out this part was kind of, I mean, a little bit, I'm oversimplifying, but it was a little bit like, yeah, that's good. Like, there really wasn't a lot of disagreement at this level of VCs in the life sciences. This gets much more complicated in the physical sciences. But in the life sciences, where most things look like, you know, there's therapeutics, we all know there's small molecule and large, you know, and large molecule therapeutics, there's diagnostics, we kind of know what we're talking about. So basically, there were 3 approaches that emerged, and it's really mostly the first 2. And it's really mostly the first one. Most universities take mid-single digit equity with anti-dilution through a Series A appropriate for the technology. There were different ways of handling that specifically. Like, I mean, at Columbia, we you know, in a normal or sort of faculty startup deal is 5% equity with anti-dilution through a Series A appropriate for the industry. We typically put in of no less than X. The other side sometimes insists on, but no greater than Y. And we sort of figure it out. I would say the most universities we talk to have something, and it may not be 5%, but something sort of mid-single digits with anti-dilution through a certain amount. There was pushback around this concept of anti-dilution. Certain VCs, not this group, actually, I think this group, everybody was fine with anti-dilution as long as it ended when they invested. So as long as it ended at the A round, it can't be perpetual because it would be sort of treating different players differently. Other universities, either instead of the first option or in addition to the first option, will take a larger equity position, 10, 15, 20%, but with no anti-dilution. And so they dilute along with everyone else. And still other universities, although this seemed like it was more a backup or a rare occurrence, but some universities, instead of equity, will take a change of control, which essentially says when the company sells, we get, 1%, 2% of the deal, regardless. Honestly, at least in our experience, and I think what we heard from most of the participants was that these three largely get you to the same economics no matter what. And I think I've seen an Osage, an OUP presentation on this. But cap table math makes my head hurt, and I've been doing this for 15 years. But like, no matter where you start on most assumptions on how a company is going to develop, the universities typically end up owning, around 1% or less of the company, 1 or 2% of the company upon acquisition. We end up owning 5% of the company at the Series A. So all roads kind of lead to the same outcome. That's what, there were different flavors in this, but I would say this took a surprisingly small amount of the conversation. This one was easy.
Thanks, Oren. Sarah, any thoughts from the VC perspective on equity?
Given what Oren just said, that all roads lead to the same outcome, I'm completely perplexed why universities would even want equity. I don't understand it. I don't understand why you wouldn't just go for the synthetic equity. I mean, the reason I, as an investor, want equity, number one driver is tax. I get all kinds of tax benefits. We'll see, maybe that'll change. But you're indifferent. So you throw the tax thing out the window, you're nonprofits. Okay, so there's not the tax. Second reason I want equity is I want the right to maintain my pro rata. You guys give away that right. I mean, kudos to Osage. You guys have found this fantastic market inefficiency and occupied that niche, but let's call it what it is. It's a market inefficiency. The universities don't use that right generally. That's why Osage exists. So, okay, so that's another reason, like, why are you fighting so hard for equity? Number three, the whole negotiation of this term is endless cycles, right? The antidilution, the brain damage, are we going to have it, up to what amount, up to what series, da, da, da. And to Oren's point about anxiety around gamesmanship, having equity, and I speak, again, as a firm that's all we have, equity, it creates a tremendous sense of anxiety because now you have to worry. There are a million ways that people can do some end run, right? A recap. We can get rid of your equity if we really want to. We can do a recapitalization of the company. We could just keep diluting the, hell out of you, et cetera. So the synthetic equity, where it's like, you know what? I'm going to get 1% on an exit. Because as Oren said, that's where we're going to come. Done. Like, it's a contract, right? I get 1%. And it's so easy too, because we're like, awesome. I mean, we're making money, you're making money, everybody should make money. And then we don't have to have those endless conversations around the equity. So my view is that synthetic equity is preferable for everybody. Except for us.
I know some of my experience was on that is that, well, equity is something you get like right up front and you have it. It can't be taken away. There's no negotiation later on, et cetera. But I know a lot of universities now who have kind of changed their practices, are looking more towards that. Karen, it looked like you wanted to make a comment as well.
And I was going to say, I think, we usually take, well, first of all, I guess in my experience, most investors have pushed back on a fixed, synthetic equity or change of control approach. And it is interesting that some will accept that, which again, I think points out that it's important to have these upfront discussions between the decision makers, to have these high level discussions about how does each side see the best scenario for a mutually beneficial deal structure. But I think the reason most tech transfer offices will take equity is that we do often, we want to share in that upside, and we want to allow the startup to be able to save on their cash early on. So I think it's an license, and it definitely, sorry, my internet just went out. It's a way to kind of hedge our bets in terms of if the startup ends up pivoting away from the licensed intellectual property, but it's a way to acknowledge the know-how and other contributions to getting the company funded and up and running.
I just realized one other thing I didn't mention, to me, is another downside for the universities of equity versus the synthetic equity is the conflicts issues. Takes all those off the table, right? We're not equity holders. I mean, honestly, in my business, if I could just have a guaranteed, if I could look at all the deals like Lauren said and said, I generally make this much, if I could say every deal I invest in, I get X% on the exit, leave me alone. Every time you do a recap and trying to get me out of the cap table, this and that, just come to me when the exit's there and I'll get my money. Sounds pretty good.
Well, we've seen some pushback from investors on the fixed change of control provision, and along the lines that, well, with equity, everyone's on equal footing. If the company goes through a rough patch and there's a big down round or a recap, some investors get washed out, some can buy up and maintain their ownership or increase it. And why would the university come through that turbulent time still with their, call it 1%, when the early investors, some of whom may be washed out and others significantly diluted? So the idea that, no matter what happens on this journey, there's 1% waiting for you at the end is sometimes very difficult for investors to accept. If everything's up and to the right, everybody's happy. But a lot of these companies have a little more turbulent path forward.
Yeah, and I think Bill, to your point, and Sarah, I think it's the perception, at least by most universities, that the people who don't want us to get these so-called golden shares are actually the VCs. It's not. So what Karen was saying was, we want to share in the upside, and any of these mechanisms will do that. And I would think most universities would be relatively agnostic as to how. The third one, usually in our experience, it's the investors who say, no way in hell are you getting golden shares that I don't have. But like Bill said, my point here, and maybe, Kirsten, I don't know if this answers it, but generally these three were the most common, with one being the most common, two being the next most, third being fine if people want it. Right.
And to me, it seems like then, especially because it sounds like different investors have different practices and different a desire to do each one of these. Perhaps, the universities stay open as to what it is that they can do that. And that's maybe part of the solution. And I think that answered actually one of the questions that came in. We have a couple more questions on equity before we move to our next topic. One was, do you typically ask for a floor when you accept no anti-dilution term?
That didn't actually come up in the discussions. Okay. And we always take anti-dilution, so it's not relevant. So I'm not sure, Karen, I'm not sure if you guys.
No, same as you.
Okay. Then we had one other question about, so someone had mentioned that there's a complexity that may be added that a change control fee could add to an IPO. Oren, would you be able to address that?
No, because I'm not sure if Sarah or Bill, we don't even ask for change of control fees typically. So, that's not relevant for us. I'm not sure if someone else knows what that complexity might be.
So I'm wondering if they're talking about this concept of shadow equity or phantom equity, where there's a cash payment due down the road, which is like a change of control fee, but the size of that payment is tied to the share price at the time of the change of control. So basically you're saying the payment should be equivalent to what X number of shares are worth if we had held those X number of shares, from day one.
Yeah.
So that is something that some universities use, and it ends up being very similar to taking actual equity in terms of the payments you get.
Yeah, there was a couple of universities are doing more of these what were called windfall fees or success fees, which actually was kind of confusing to many of us. I think what really came out was that typically those are used as a way of solving a problem in the negotiation. So for instance, if for some reason the startup can't actually give enough equity at the intro, or let's say for some structural reason, they're limited in their ability to provide market rate milestones, or otherwise have to compromise on, some other term, that some universities are saying, fine, but then you can make that up to us by, like, if your company valuation ever hits $1 billion, you owe us X. Or, upon an IPO or a big commercial sales milestone, you owe us, a big number, like 10, 15, $50 million. So that's happened. We haven't done that much at Columbia, but really what came out was that was a sort of very custom crafted scenario to solve a very specific problem. It's not something that's in a term sheet, in a template.
All right, we're gonna stop the slide sharing now because the rest of our questions don't have any slides associated with them. Bill, really quickly, we're going. Can you touch on the participation rights and where those ended up at? And then we're going to move on to royalties after that. And Karen, we'll have you chime in on those. We've got half an hour left for everyone who's on the webinar. Just FYI, we're going to try to get to all the questions that have come in too.
Sure. So the concept of a participation right or a preemptive right, can be driven, and historically was driven pro rata, based on the equity that the institution was granted at founding. A number of institutions, really pioneered by Stanford, went to more of just a fixed percentage approach. And the real question is, well, what happens if it's not utilized in the first financing? So there's a right of some percentage to participate, and the university doesn't participate. Does that right in the next round then, dilute down over time, pro rata? If it's fixed percentage, does it stay flat going forward at some point? What happens to it? And there was a lot of back and forth on, use it or lose it, or what happens to it diluting over time. And, that's something that I think is still negotiated and will be negotiated. The concept of the ability for the institution to maintain its ownership by investing at the same price and terms as other investors, I think was acceptable. The question was, what happens to it over time if it's not utilized? Can you wait 4 rounds and then invest using that participation right? And, certainly a pro rata right will dilute, so that could be quite small. And for the fixed percentage approach, those decrease over time as well. And I think we didn't really come out, I don't think we came out with a hard solution or, anything specific, but acknowledgement that this issue of dilution over time, if unexercised, is usually incorporated in some fashion.
Great, thanks, Bill. All right, we're going to move on to earned royalties. Karen has noted in the life science term sheet recommendations, earned royalties are often where universities actually receive the bulk of their revenue. And the thought is that if the company wins, then the public and the university win as well, with both obviously helpful products that are on the market and revenues that go back into the university that provide more funding for research at the universities that hopefully then again provides more potential products that help everyone. So could you talk about the discussion that was had amongst the universities and the VCs about royalties and what the recommendations were? And we already have a number of questions that have come in around royalties too. So.
Sure. Yeah. There weren't specifics discussed in terms of, the royalties should be in this range, although I think we all agreed they tend to fall within a fairly narrow range. But I think what everyone really firmly agreed on is that one should not focus too much on any one term over others. And there is sometimes a tendency, I think, for universities to think, I have to get that 5% royalty or whatever the number is. And it's royalties are, I mean, yes, universities who have a successful licensed product being marketed, yes, they get most of their downstream income from those royalties, but the likelihood that you will ever see a royalty on a licensed product is pretty low. And if you see a potential fight coming up over where the royalty should be set, take a step back and think about, where can I capture that value otherwise? And maybe it's in higher, clinical milestone payments or more equity. And for the university, higher earlier payment, it comes with less risk. So, and your university might actually be happy to have that additional money up front for other needs. So I think the discussion revolved largely around, not focusing on any one term. And that also gets to when you do benchmarking, and I think everyone agreed that benchmarking can be helpful. And there are many different databases that can be helpful in this sense. And of course, OUP does a great job of tracking license terms and allowing the partners to check in with them. But when you do the benchmarking, again, don't just say, well, here's this license for a similar technology and we got a 4% royalty. Well, maybe you got that because you gave up on, you didn't take any equity, you didn't take an upfront. I mean, it's, where there's another license where you actually had a 2% royalty on a similar technology, but that's because you did take equity and upfront fees. And, so again, you need to look at these things as a package. Don't consider any given term. And I don't care if it's at the equity percentage, if it's the royalty, the milestones, don't consider any one term in isolation of the others. And then finally, we did all agree that royalties need to be set according to the factors that are specific for the case. For example, how strong is the intellectual property? How broad is it, and how easy is it to enforce versus how easy is it for others to work around? What stage of development is it at? How de-risked is the technology? You're likely to get a very different royalty for, a drug target than you are for a set of molecules that are close to being IND enabled. Think about background intellectual property needs. There are some technologies that require multiple licenses, so freedom to operate licenses from other entities. Think about the CRISPR situation. So if the startup has to take licenses from all of these other entities for that background intellectual property, then the royalty that they can pay for your technology may be lower. So I think we all agreed that you need to look at different factors. We did not discuss any specific numbers.
Right. Bill, did you want to comment, or Sarah, also on the VC perspective? And then when we're just talking about life science opportunities here, but royalties in the life sciences, and in general, my experience is you do receive earned royalties on life science products from your licenses out of universities. But anything else from the VC perspective on earned royalties?
I don't have anything to add beyond what Karen said. I think you summarized it really well. Yeah.
Yeah, nor do I. I mean, I think the venture community recognizes that, and it is typical. I don't have anything really to add.
Okay.
I will add, that is where, so this is one of those terms where it is such a pleasure to do business with VCs that know what they're doing, because no one argues about royalties when you're talking to RA Capital or Five. I mean, you might argue about what the numbers should be, or structures, or declining, or increasing, but the concept of royalties is pretty clear. And in fact, one of the VCs, I won't name them, said they actually did a study on the exit valuation of the startups based on the incoming royalty rate that was set for the underlying license agreement, and found that there was essentially no impact. As long as the royalty rate was within the sort of normal range, that whether it was 3% or 4% or 5% or 6% had no discernible impact on the exit value that the investors received. On the other hand, when you are talking to VCs that have not done university deals or have not done life science deals or don't do a lot of deals, you will often hear people say like, why do you deserve royalties? That's crazy. Or like, tell me why you deserve them. And I think that's one of the areas where I think in general, these term sheets have been really helpful. A lot of us have had the experience. So even just in the last 6 months since they got released of, when you encounter either a university or a VC that doesn't have this kind of experience, and you get that kind of passion and animosity early on, to be able to just send them the links and say, read this, then let's talk. Because if it's good enough for RA Capital and Venrock and Atlas and 5 AM and Polaris, it's probably good enough for you. And I think similarly, if you have a university that's coming in and saying, we deserve 75% of the equity, or I need anti-dilution through the C round, send them the document. It's like, if it's good enough for MIT and Stanford and maybe Columbia, it's probably good enough for you. So that's taken a lot of the heat out of the conversations.
Yeah, and that really helps. And someone actually, one of our attendees was asking about that, about whether you found that this resonates with small VCs and individual entrepreneurs, especially in terms of equity. And have you had any feedback, from?
Yeah, I mean, both directly at Columbia, but also I know Johns Hopkins said this happened to them, and I think Duke also, but like mostly with inexperienced VCs. But if someone comes and says, that's crazy, or it has to be this way, or my law firm's telling me no one ever pays X, just ship the link over. And then you can say, like, if you still disagree, let's talk, but you should at least know what the norms are. Similarly, like, no one buys a car without checking Kelley Blue Book. Like, just know what the market is.
Right.
You're going to look like an idiot if you walk into a car lot and say like $15 final offer. Like, that's just not the way it works. So
we have two more questions on royalties from the audience. One is, aren't royalties a key issue to the potential buyer of the technology? And so this term has to work long term. So in the case of, we're dealing with startups here. Since we're VCs, we're talking about startups. This is something that has to be potentially that works for the acquirer, because often these agreements can be assigned to an acquirer. And I imagine that comes into play when we're talking about royalties. Oren, do you want to address that one since you're already off mute?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit before, but basically, per what the VC said, that in the life sciences, royalties are standard, and biopharma knows how to acquire companies that have royalties.
Yeah.
In the physical sciences, this is a massively more confusing question, and so I think one of the most common points of feedback we got about this whole effort was, cool, but what about software, or what about semiconductors, or what about clean energy? Yeah. Totally valid, really important, so much harder. And so like doing life science, it's not that it's easy, but it's way easier than doing physical sciences deals. And so we said, we'll get to that someday.
Right. I think that's very appropriate. We had a question about sublicensing and royalties. And I don't know if you guys, how much you got into that, about a pass-through earned royalty through the sublicenses versus the percentage for non-royalty sublicensing revenue. Yeah.
So do you want to jump to the sublicensing talk?
I mean, quickly, so since someone asked about it, that'd be great.
Sure. I hate sublicensing. So it was really interesting. Like in these discussions, there were some areas where we were like, yeah, okay, we got it. Like, we're going to end up at the same place. We all agree fundamentally. Let's just agree. There were like 3 areas that we talked for hours and got really nowhere except for a common understanding of why we don't agree. Sublicensing was one of those. So, and it's complicated for a bunch of reasons. Everyone sort of fundamentally agreed that when the startup sublicenses their the university's IP to Pfizer, that the university should benefit. how was really confusing. I mean, at least for us, and I think for most of the universities, a pass-through royalty is absolutely standard. Like, we don't care who sells the product. If you sell the product, or if you decide to sublicense someone else and they sell the product, we're still going to get the same royalty on that. That's absolutely market. And I don't think the VCs had any concerns about that part. Everything else about this was confusing though. So like the so-called non-royalty sublicensing income, or the money that, you know, if a big pharma company comes and sublicenses the university's IP and also pays a $50 million one-time payment for the right to do so, how does that get split up? What if that happens in phase 3 versus phase 1? What if the university's IP is bundled along with some patents from the startup? What if the patents from the startup weren't that important, but there's more of them? What if they get paid in equity instead of cash? Like, what about all the money that the startup has put into doing R&D and plans to put into R&D? Like, they're going to take that 50 million bucks and develop the university's product with it. Why should they pay you a tax on it? Seems like double dipping. On the other hand, what if the startup's going to use that money to pay for developing their own products that don't impact their university's patent? And therefore the university is going to get no benefit from that R&D cost. Well, then why should we not get, take our tax? Like, the best I can say about sublicensing was that we all walked away saying, wow, I guess I understand why this is so hard, but not really a common sense of the right path.
Yeah, I think to say with what Oren was saying, this concept of double dipping was a big one, and I felt like we had a really interesting discussion when I brought up the point that, particularly for a platform technology that has multiple potential applications, if we are giving a startup exclusive rights to that platform to exploit it for all of those potential indications or applications, we're essentially, we want to do that to enable the startup to get appropriate investment. But by the same token, we're giving up the chance to possibly do 3 or 4 different licenses ourselves. So the sub-licensing fee is one mechanism that we use to kind of acknowledge that fact and get value, but only when the startup is getting that value from having done the sub-license. So I think it again gets back to this kind of concept of having those high-level discussions at the very beginning, and why am I going to insist on some sort of sub-licensing fee? Well, because this is a platform, and from our perspective, we could have licensed it out for ag biotech as well as life sciences and maybe research tool companies. So it's I think so much of our discussion was really around I never thought about that perspective before, and it was a lot about gaining understanding of each party's where they're coming from and what the issues are for them in entering into a deal, and then figuring out, okay, well then how can I address this?
It was super interesting to me, the existential, like, we got at some point, I think it was in the middle meeting, we got into this question of what are the existential crises for a university and for a venture investor? And how does that then drive why we all care about what we care about? And so the existential crisis for like Karen or me is, we do a deal with a startup and we put all our eggs in basket A, and it turns out the startup gets all its value from basket B. And then the trustees come back later and be like, cool, your startup sold for $3 billion. How much of that did we get? And we go, no, we didn't. Our equity got washed. It was a reverse anti-ratchet, whatever Bill Harrington talks about. And then all of a sudden, we have a new job and we're looking for a new position at some other university. Meanwhile, the startups and the VCs, what's their existential crisis? Their existential crisis is that they've raised precious dollars that are, every penny needs to go to developing product. And there's some term in the university license that bleeds cash out along the way before they could pay for it. So like milestone fees were a big topic of conversation. Like, why do we want milestone fees as a university? When you enter phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3, your value has gone up tremendously. So we want a piece of that. Why don't VCs want to pay that? Because like they don't have the cash. They haven't partnered with anyone yet. And so like that's just going to come straight from the VC pocket otherwise. And so until, so one of the things we talked about, which is links to in the agreement, I'm sorry, I'm shaking my head like you can see what I'm looking at, the term sheets over there. But in the agreements, we talk about like very clever ways to skin that cat of saying, your milestones are what they are, but you don't pay them until they're sort of accrued until you've partnered or sold the company and have access to biopharma cash. Or they start low, but get multiplied up by 10x when you partner. So anyways, just like those kind of like, why do we care was really important.
I have, there's so many questions coming in and we only have just over 10 minutes left. So I'm going to direct a question to Sarah and Bill. And it's more about VCs working with the startups. And then some VCs are really good about talking with the TTO, with the tech transfer office as well. Others, perhaps they're not getting into that conversation. Can you talk about VCs potentially having guidance for startups and getting involved in that conversation with the tech transfer offices? Because it's definitely been, in my experience, it's very varied as well. Sometimes there seems to always be kind of these middle people that are getting in the conversations when we were talking about the process before. Sometimes it's easier if you all just sit down together, right?
And Kirsten, just so I'm clear, are you talking about during a negotiation or in general or after a company's been funded?
During a negotiation. I mean, otherwise the conversations really are between the startup and the tech transfer office, unless, Oren and Karen disagree, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think the venture firms are working with the university and really with the founder, and if there's an embryonic team of some sort or somebody kind of putting the business together, that's where most of the dialogue is around the science, the vision, the market, the application, start working out early operating plans and budgets. And, what sort of team do we need to hire? What are the critical translational experiments? If it's work that's only been done in a university setting, typically investors like to repeat some of the seminal experiments or design, key translational experiments and conduct them at a CRO, in a more robust commercial setting. So deals are tranched that way. And so there's some interaction there with the founder and management team as you start to kind of craft a path forward, and with that, an operating plan. That's not so much the connectivity to the TTO in that regard. I mean, that the tech transfer office would be negotiating the terms of the deal, but in terms of the terms of the company and the operating plan for the company and what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, that's usually done between the lead investor and the entrepreneur / management team.
Great.
Or PI for that matter.
I will say though that, I would say we don't usually do the majority of the negotiation directly with investors. That's true. But some of the most successful negotiations that we have experienced in our office have been where the investor, the lead investor, has been readily available for comment or questions, and with whom we actually have had direct conversations. I think it's been really helpful because the investor can bring certain knowledge that the entrepreneur might not yet have.
Yeah, that gets back to the original discussion around process and trying to get, alignment early between the lead investor and, senior folks at the TTO.
All right, we've got a number of questions left. I'm going to try to get through what we can. And so these are all going to be audience questions. One person commented, we get a lot of pushback on consent for assignment. Is there a creative way to deal with this? And what are your thoughts in general about, potentially a university giving consent for assignment versus it being automatic and just part of the agreement. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this from a VC perspective?
Well, obviously, we would view it as important that on a change of control, it be automatic. To suddenly have somebody who has such outsized, like veto power. I mean, maybe by that point, they're a 1% stockholder in a change of control transaction. Like, how did that happen in the legal documents?
Right. Warren, any thoughts from the university perspective there?
No, I mean, I honestly, this doesn't come up that much for us. I think we usually ask for notification.
Yeah.
I think we may sometimes ask for approval if there's a reason for concern, but typically notification is what, notification of and saying that our license agreement supersedes their license, their sub-license agreement, so that if there's a conflict between the two, ours wins. As it relates to RIP is the norm.
Okay.
For us, at least. It wasn't something we talked about in this agreement.
Okay. Another person asked, you said sublicensing was one area in which you walked away understanding why this discussion is hard, but not gaining, perhaps coming to a full common understanding on how it was going to work. What are the other areas where finding commonalities were difficult? Oren, you're laughing already, so I'm picking on you.
Other product royalties, future improvements was one. And then mandatory sublicensing diligence terms was the other. And totally obvious after the meetings why those are so hard. But it's one of those areas where people's passion gets really high. So just other product royalties. This gets back to that existential fear that universities have. We're licensing you a patent. You really love the patent. You think the patent's really important. And in fact, you really want the faculty and their graduate students involved because teaching you how to do it is so important. And a couple of years in, the early investors aren't there anymore. Maybe they're not leading the rounds. The early entrepreneurs have moved on. And the B round people are looking at it as being like, first of all, we're not even using that first patent anymore. We found a better way to do this, so we're not using it. Secondly, I don't remember those conversations with the university. That doesn't sound like something that we were here for. So we don't owe you patent royalties. You're welcome to take your patent back. And we're not going to pay you those other product royalties either, because we weren't here for that. So we don't remember them. And all of a sudden, we now are in that situation of telling our trustees again, yeah, no, it's really cool that, RA's startup got sold to Merck and now it's on the market and they're generating $5 billion a year. Yeah, but we don't get royalties on that. I'm not sure why. So getting sort of a broad understanding of that is important. On the other hand, the VCs totally understandably say the challenge with other product royalties is if they're defined too broadly, then it makes it really hard to sell the company or partner with anyone. Which was something, honestly, we'd never thought of. I think we often end up in this butting heads of yes, other product royalties, no other product royalties. And really what it came down to was there's a time window where that makes sense. But at some point, the goal of all these companies is largely to get acquired. And if they're going to get acquired, then you need to make it such that the other product royalties term in the agreement doesn't end up tainting all of Merck's other products. Otherwise, they'll never buy the startup. And you need a way to differentiate when the startup is still using those know-how royalties or when they're not anymore, and which products are therefore touched. So it turned into a really productive conversation. I don't think we got to an outcome. I think Yale has a model which we love around this and are trying to get done at Columbia that the VCs seem to resonate with, which essentially says, as long as the faculty or graduate students are getting compensated by the startup, so receiving new equity grants or cash, then any products the startup is developing during that window will be deemed other products without any further discussion. And the trade-off there is, and any products that are developed at the university during that time frame will automatically get rolled into the license as well. So there's a trade-off. The startup gets access to the inventors and gets any improvements that they invent during this collaboration time. And the university doesn't need to worry that they're going to get cut out of that. So I thought that was very, very creative. And it didn't seem like you got a lot of pushback from the VCs either. So we're trying to put that in place at Columbia. I don't know if that'll happen.
Thanks. I have two more questions. I'm sorry to everyone that we have not gotten to everyone's questions that they submitted here. And I'm really glad that we got to the other products discussion because I know we wanted to talk about that. One is, have you found that these best practices hold as they cross over into academic medical institutions? So not just universities, but medical institutions. Just really quickly, Oren, any conversations on there?
I haven't heard any directly. Karen, have you? No.
No.
I don't know why they wouldn't.
Right.
It's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that would be a lot different than having an academic medical center as part of your university. So
I agree. Great. And then the last question that I had that we touched on at the very beginning of this, and Sarah actually touched on when she was answering one of her questions, was what are the next steps? What happens next for these recommendations? And as you know, there's other things that OUP has been working on, and I know others have been talking about with regards to startup licenses. So, Oren, do you want to touch on that? And everyone
Actually, I'm going to just let Sarah touch on this because this was really her. Most of us were exhausted at the end of going through this, and frankly, people sort of stopped responding to emails and texts. So I think we all hit the burnout level, and Sarah had just a remarkable energy. Maybe it's all that treadmill that to keep going. So Sarah, maybe you could talk about what happens next.
So I think the ambition of this group is minimally to come up with a kind of model term sheet that'll have different flavors. If you're not familiar with it, I'd encourage you to go look at the NBCA website, NBCA model documents, which by the way, get about 10,000 downloads a month. That should be our ambition. We should compete with them for downloads once we're done. And then to move on to an actual license agreement from there. As I said before, even if some of the really gnarly parts, maybe it's very telegraphic for, other product royalties or something, you just kind of have bullet points, refer to the term sheet. But I think change of control provisions, we can have sort of an agreed upon provision there and a footnote to everybody explaining why it is. And maybe if you have some weird concern about competitors or something, you can annotate it as follows. But I think we could eliminate a lot of time on the boilerplate stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm super excited to see those next step. Hopefully, working on them too with you. We're at the end of our webinar. We're at the end of our time. We really want to collect everyone's feedback on this. There's a chat and there's a survey that's linked in the chat box. You'll be getting it, I think, too, when you close out of here. We really appreciate everyone's feedback because it does help us decide each one of these webinars. And we will be sending this recording of this out afterwards. In the meantime, Oren, Karen, Sarah, Bill, and thank you so much for all your time today. I think that this was a really productive discussion. Obviously, there were a lot of questions that came in. We really appreciate the audience submitting your questions and your attendance at the webinar. So everyone stay safe, stay healthy. We hope to see you again sometime soon and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.